Vamos a dar paso a nuestra siguiente ponente, Alba Jimeno de la Rinaga, is a student of the PhD program in Comparative Literature and Literary Studies of the University of the Basque Country after finishing their degree on English Studies with a minor on literature at the same university. They went on to complete the master program on comparative literature and literary studies on the University of the Basque Country too. Their dissertation being a study of the adaptation and original of the Haunting of Hill Houses by Shirley Jackson from a queer and feminist perspective. They afterwards complete a master program on secondary school teaching in the UEU. Their thesis dissertation dealing with the possibilities teaching science fiction literature opens in the secondary school curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much. I am going to try my best to stick to time. And I am going to be the abduct here. I am not going to be talking about vampires. I am going to be talking about colonial figures in colonialism. So my talk is titled An Adventure in Country, the Myth of Empire and the Terror. So, in 1845, two Royal Navy ships left England in an attempt to finally discover a navigable passage through the Arctic. They were the most technologically advanced ships of the day. They were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay, awaiting good conditions to enter the Arctic labyrinth. Both ships then vanished. These are the opening lines, well, the opening title cards for the show adaptation of the 2007 novel The Terror, which is a supernatural take on what might have happened to John Franklin's 1845 Arctic expedition. The adaptation was carried out by Dave Kajanek and Stu Hugh, who both have worked in movies and movie scripts, which heavily delved into topics related to both gender, masculinities, and racial oddness, Pachinko being the latter, and Kajanek being a collaborator of well-known director Luca Guadagnino. So what is the Lost Franklin expedition, or what was Franklin's Lost expedition? So during the Victorian era in 1845, as I have mentioned, they basically sent a ship to navigate the Northwest Passage, which is this bit of sea that appears during the summer and spring at the top of Canada, in between islands and peninsula, to go to Russia, China, and have an easier route that down through Brazil and South America, because basically it was terrible to navigate down there. This passage was already charted. They had the route planned, and then both ships and 128 men disappeared until like 5 years ago, when the ships reappeared. Well, they didn't resurface, but we know where they are now. There were plenty of searches with like a lot of money put by John Franklin's wife. And in an 1847 expedition, John Ray basically was the first man who went inland, talked to the natives, and he was told that basically these white men who looked very sickly had eaten each other and died of both scurvy and the bad weather conditions. So during the British Discovery Service during this age didn't have much to discover. Like per se, most of the world was already charted. And when we say that they were the most technologically advanced ships at the time, it's because they were literally, in the sense that they had these steam engines, they had all this technology to actually push through the ice, but they were also charged inside with the most advanced technology at the time to actually investigate sea creatures. They had the first photographic devices to take pictures, etc. The show, and well, in general, as you might know, science is yet another cultural device employed by our culture, Victorian culture at the time, to further their ideology. As quoting Edward Said, nations themselves are narrations. The power to narrate or to block other narratives from forming and emerging is very important to culture and imperialism, and constitutes one of the main connections between them. As I will later explain, this is plainly seen in the show by how the books they carry, the kind of cultural discussions they have. Like we may talk about Marvel, or we may talk about why we think that Dracula is a canonical text, for example. Moving on, also, when we talk about imperialism, we have to talk about the core and everything around it, the colonies and everything that's not a colony. The ships themselves, we have to envision as part of England. We have to imagine that this part of land has displaced and gone sailing. We cannot imagine them as something else. Again, as I previously mentioned, most of everything in the world was already charted, even if not fully explored. So exploration in the mid-19th century was valued not necessarily by its achievements, but by the perils a particular expedition overcame. Therefore, even the most disastrous expedition had the potential for imperial greatness because it built heroes, it built stories. You could tell about all these people who went all this place and then they did it in the name of the Queen. So expansion for the sake of expansion, we could call it, which at the end of the day is one of the many definitions of imperialism as it is. Again, as I mentioned before, it's a bit dark. I am sorry, I should have brightened the photos. As mentioned before, the ships were riddled with all this culture that was approved and sanctioned in land. We have all these texts that came from this neoclassical, street, that happened in the Enlightenment, that have Greek and Roman origin. They compare themselves to classical figures, to Julius Caesar. They mention stories by Xenophon. They mention Aristotle, and the books that they can read in the ships themselves, because they carried like huge libraries in those ships, where it went from Paradise Lost to accounts from previous expeditions to, tell them to be brave, to go on, to continue. Also, this is marker of class, which was super important in the ship to maintain the hierarchies. If you were in our roundtable just today, I mentioned how these ships were divided. So the officer class and the doctors and the people who served in the stewards had access to only some bits of the ships, like they had private rooms, they had doors, they had beds, and then everyone else, sailors and marines, were basically only had access to the places where they worked and the places where they ate and slept, which were usually the same room, reconditioned during day and night. And as mentioned, the class markers I mentioned is that some of these books were in Greek, some of the books were in Latin. Most of the sailors were illiterate, because this is just when literacy is starting to happen to what is starting to happen to us, to the working class. So if you could read, that was great. But if you could read in Latin or Greek, you probably came from a rich family or family with standing. And also the Bible, as she has mentioned before, and Hela has mentioned before, we cannot escape Christianity. And there were differences between the kinds of Christian you could be. There was discrimination. So the Bible was a King James version. And, don't be Catholic. Don't be Catholic. Anyways, the terror also engagement textually with this engagement with actual culture and how they portray the expedition themselves. In the first expedition, I was going to say. In the first episode, there's this series of tableau vivants in which we can see how how they represent previous colonial endeavors, both in America and other places, and how, as mentioned, literally taken from Said again and his text on culture and imperialism, how culture is a sort of theater where various political and ideological causes engage with one another. Far from a placid realm of Apollonian gentility, culture can be a battleground which causes expose themselves to the light of day and contend with one another. Different students from different parts of the world who are taught to read their national classics before they read others are expected to appreciate and belong logically, often uncritically, to the nations and traditions while denigrating or fighting against others. This is how you actually build this ideology, and this is how you build what everyone here believes, because we have grown up reading El Lazarillo de Tormes, or we have been taught at our different majors how it is super important to know Paradise Lost and why it's relevant to English literature, etc. Anyways, in this tableau vivants, we can include images from previous expeditions to Antarctica and the Arctic, mirroring an image that will later reflect a positive, artificial image of what will later actually be the expedition. There's a mirror in one of the later chapters I will discuss later. That's actually very interesting, because you have this image grandeur, British flags, everyone's an officer, everyone's well-dressed, and they're having a grand old time getting to the Arctic and discovering, where the magnetic South Pole is. Anyways, what happens when you belong to empire, but you're not the ideal figure of empire? The Terror does this by actually presenting us with a very wide range of male characters. They're all male, they're white, but most of them don't actually belong to these ideal man they should be. To the protagonists, which are positioned as people we should root for, because at the end of the day, even if they are colonial figures, the show has a very humane approach to the narrative and the stories, are flawed, and not only in the sense that they are morally grey, or they are flawed to empire. Francis Crozier, who is elevated as the protagonist, is Irish, a Catholic, and has a humble origin. He didn't come from a affluent family. He raised from a ship's boy to a captain. When the other man who ends up being the commander of the other ship of Erebus, Captain James Fitzjames, is a bastard son of a consul general in Brazil. He actually did get to his position thanks to, actual money, actual standing, but he doesn't feel like he belongs there because, as in his words, he's not even fully English. He also has a whole lot of problems with his gender, I would argue. I wrote a really long article on it like a week ago, so I have plenty to talk about him. But yeah, a carnival happens in the middle point of the show, demarcating the point at which they abandon the ships, and he cosplays as Britannia, the queen, well, not queen, but the inspirational figure of Britain, who is a woman, and he's not a leader, is an inspiration, and she's also British, and he's not. There's a lot going on here. I skipped a slide with more people because I wanted to go to people who actually are not in power, people who are stewards, who are in contact with power and believe themselves to have some kind of possibility of ascent, like happens with Billy Gibson, who is queer. He's in a relationship with a little man I will discuss after this. And he believes that he can surpass this oppression or this position in which he doesn't have much to do. Henry Pegler and John Bridgens, who are also in a romantic relationships, have they use classical texts to inspire one another, and they do not have any kind of desire to fight back against the establishment. They are content with their positions. And then we have the elephant in the room, or like I like to call him, the rat in the orlop deck, Kanisiki. That's not his real name, which we learn really late in the show. He's not Irish, even if he presents himself as Irish. He has lower class origin, and he does not understand or care for Royal Navy protocol. It does help that he's queer, and he thinks that this is all garbage. He just wants to get out of Britain, of the establishment. We don't know why, which actually enriches his character a lot. And he's a very interesting figure because on the one hand, he does represent everything that's fighting back against everything that we have mentioned, this cultural hegemony, this everything that is pushing and absorbing the lower classes of empire into the mechanisms to make it work. But at the same time, he does end up replicating a lot of the ideology. He is very openly racist. He is depicted as this queer figure who can push back, but at the same time, he wants to kill the Inuit, because they are, on the one hand, they are being nuisances to him. They are making his escape more difficult, which it's already difficult. He's trapped in the ice. But also he's replicating figures around cannibalism and Irishness, which were popular during Victorian times. I don't know if you're aware, but at the time, well, years before, Jonathan Swift wrote A Modest Proposal, which was basically a text that said, satirical, of course, we should eat Irish babies to, keep the empire fed. But at the time, there were also a lot of legends and narratives about Irish people who were eating other people because apparently in a weekly, someone wrote about a man eating pieces from a corpse in a beach, widely contested, but So Hiki ends up doing a lot of things, but primarily what I want to focus on is this one of the final images in the show, well, in the final episode of the show, in which Hiki basically tries to become the dominating force of the supernatural entity that's been chasing them, and openly defies, not defines, everything that empire means to these people. One of the first things he says being, what if we're not the heroes of the story? He's very aware of everything that has been happening, not only to him, but to everyone around him. Bagger Nelson, Bagger Victoria, Bagger Nelson, Bagger Jesus, Bagger Joseph and Mary, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, none of them wanted nothing from me. He is establishing himself as someone else, but he's also surrounded by people who have followed him on this mutiny that his partner basically told him, hey, maybe we should run, and who are also in the same position as him. He's trying to draw them with him out of the security that empire is giving them, and actually it's the ideal situation because they have literally nowhere else to go. He is this figure of resistance, and at the same time, and who cannot be absorbed by the empire, as I've mentioned. He cannot be subsumed. So at the end of the day, the narrative does end up being completely eliminating him because he cannot do anything with him. But at the same time, Croatia, who is the other key protagonist at the end of the day, ends up stranded in the middle of the Arctic. He has seen too much. He has walked away, literally away from empire, and cannot go back, even if the friend he went to the Antarctica with has come back to get him. He cannot feel himself part of the machine. He cannot feed it. He cannot be a cog. Anyway, so conclusions. The terror employs all the symbols, narratives, and figure of Victorian power to openly criticize colonial hunger, and depicts how otherness is repurposed into all these cogs and imperial machine. Cogs who must be obedient. As I have mentioned, it will automatically discard them. Instead of, as mentioned, otherness can exist. It has to exist because we are not perfect. None of us can perfectly adhere to this ideology, to this working machine, as I mentioned multiple times. But at the same time, if you are too noisy, if you're too problematic, you're going to be cast out. Anyways, thank you very much. This is my email if anyone wants to come to me, references, and it's been a pleasure.